Across 17,000 civilized star systems, there existed a universal truth that every species acknowledged with the solemnity of natural law. Some planets were simply incompatible with biological life, as intelligent beings preferred it, not the sterile, airless rocks that floated through the void like cosmic paperweights. Those were just dead. The truly problematic worlds were the ones that seemed almost right, the ones that whispered sweet promises of habitability before dissolving your respiratory system into something resembling organic soup. The Federation of Aligned Worlds maintained an exhaustive catalog of these nightmare spheres, ranking them on a scale that ranged from mild discomfort to your descendants will tell cautionary tales about your hubris. Class 7 planets occupied the upper tier of this hierarchy, reserved for worlds where the atmosphere itself possessed what could only be described as malicious intent. Sulfur dioxide concentrations that would make a volcanic vent seem refreshing. Methane levels that turned breathing into a game of chemical roulette. Atmospheric pressure that could compress a Vrelian exoskeleton into something approximating a fancy paperweight. Kepler 442f held the distinction of being a Class 7 world with honors, if such a thing could be said to exist. Its atmosphere was a toxic symphony of compounds that shouldn't coexist outside of a chemistry lab's worst accident. Oxygen sat at a measly 8%, which was already problematic for most species. But the real charm came from the 32% carbon dioxide, elevated methane concentrations, and trace amounts of hydrogen sulfide that gave the whole affair a distinctive rotting eggs meets industrial accident ambiance. The atmospheric pressure measured at 2.3 standard units, enough to make most aliens feel like they were being hugged by a particularly aggressive hydraulic press. For 300 standard cycles, the planet had hosted an automated mining operation, extracting rare isotopes that made faster-than-light travel marginally less impossible. Robots handled everything, because robots didn't require breathable air or care about atmospheric composition beyond its impact on equipment corrosion. It was an elegant solution that had worked flawlessly until 6 rotations ago, when the primary processing facility experienced what maintenance logs euphemistically termed a critical malfunction. In less diplomatic language, something had exploded, taken out the main reactor, and left the backup systems in a state that could generously be called questionable. The facility needed manual intervention, which meant sending living beings into an environment that actively wanted them dead. The Vrelian engineers had calculated survival times for various species. Methaxians could last approximately 4 minutes before their gill analogs seized up. Karathi might manage 7 minutes with proper protective gear before the atmospheric pressure started causing internal hemorrhaging. Even the notoriously resilient Drenthi, who evolved on a world with higher gravity and a chlorine-based atmosphere, gave the place a solid absolutely not in their official assessment, which made the humans' offer to handle the situation somewhere between amusing and baffling. The regional administrator, a Vrelian named Kethrix, who had seen 3 centuries of bureaucratic absurdity, reviewed the application with all 4 of his optical organs, focused on the datapad. Humans had been part of the Federation for barely 2 decades, a blink in galactic terms. They were the newcomers who still got excited about wormhole travel and asked too many questions during diplomatic functions. Enthusiastic, certainly, capable of surviving a Class 7 environment. The very suggestion violated everything the scientific community understood about biological limitations. Their homeworld is classified as Class 3, his assistant offered, mandibles clicking in what might have been amusement or concern. Elevated oxygen compared to standard, but otherwise manageable. Class 3, Kethrix repeated, tasting the words like they were spoiled nutrition paste. And they believe this qualifies them for Class 7 operations. The human liaison insists their species has what she called extensive experience with hostile environments. She seemed quite confident. Confidence, Kethrix had learned, was not the same as competence, but the facility was hemorrhaging value with each passing rotation, and every other species had declined the contract with varying degrees of politeness. The Methaxians had simply transmitted a 2-hour lecture about atmospheric chemistry and proper risk assessment. The humans, by contrast, had submitted their bid within 3 hours of the posting going public, complete with technical specifications and personnel files. Desperation made strange bedfellows, as the saying went in approximately 40% of Federation languages. The human arrived on a transport vessel that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts and optimistic thinking, which was apparently standard for their civilian craft. She emerged from the airlock wearing a standard environment suit, nothing fancy, just the basic model that most species used for short-term exposure to mildly hostile conditions. Her biological data streamed across Kethrix's display: elevated heart rate compared to baseline, which was expected, oxygen saturation at 98%, temperature regulation within normal human parameters. She was, by all observable metrics, unremarkably average for her species. "Station Commander," she said, her translator rendering the words in perfectly acceptable galactic standard. "Appreciate the opportunity. When can we review the facility schematics?" Kethrix gestured toward the observation deck, where Kepler 442f rotated below them with the serene indifference of a world that didn't care about the biological complications it presented. Through the reinforced viewport, the planet's atmosphere swirled in shades of amber and rust, beautiful in the way that poisonous creatures often were. "Before we discuss logistics, I must ensure you understand the environmental parameters," Kethrix said, pulling up the atmospheric analysis on the central display. Numbers cascaded across the screen in red, because apparently every species agreed that red meant danger on some fundamental level. "The oxygen concentration is insufficient for human respiratory function. The carbon dioxide levels are toxic. The atmospheric pressure exceeds human tolerance thresholds by a significant margin, and the trace compounds include several that are corrosive to organic tissue." The human studied the readout with an expression that Kethrix's translation software struggled to interpret. Not fear, certainly, not even concern. Something closer to appraisal? "The facility has breathable atmosphere inside, correct?" she asked. "The main complex maintains life support, yes, but the damaged sections where you'll be working are exposed to external atmosphere. You'll need to traverse approximately 200 meters of open-air environment to reach the reactor core. Even with protective equipment, most species cannot survive that exposure." "Most species," she repeated, and something in her tone suggested she'd heard similar warnings before. "What's the timeline we're working with?" "Ideally, 4 rotations. The backup systems will fail completely after that, and we'll lose containment on the isotope storage, which would be, to put it mildly, problematic." 4 days, she said, translating the units automatically. "That's doable. I'll need to review the schematics tonight and do a preliminary survey tomorrow. Actual repairs can start the day after." Kethrix's mandibles twitched. "You understand that the preliminary survey involves exposing yourself to the planet's atmosphere?" "I caught that part, yes." "And you're comfortable with this?" The human's face did something complicated, an expression that involved the corners of her mouth pulling upward in a way that showed teeth. Her species used this gesture to indicate pleasure or amusement, though Kethrix had never quite understood why displaying weapons was considered friendly. "Commander," she said, "I grew up in a place called Arizona, spent 5 years working industrial sites in northern China, and did a stint at a mining operation in what used to be the Congo Basin. My lungs have seen things that would make your atmospheric analysis look like a vacation brochure." Kethrix didn't understand most of those references, but he recognized confidence when he heard it. Possibly misplaced confidence, but confidence nonetheless. "Very well. We'll prepare for your survey at first light, local time. I'll have medical staff standing by." "Appreciate it," she said, then paused. "One question, though. Is there a weight limit? On personal equipment I can bring planet-side?" Within reason, no. Why? That expression again, the one with teeth. Just want to make sure I can bring my lighter. Kethrix filed that away as another incomprehensible human quirk and moved on to the logistical briefings. The human listened attentively, asked intelligent questions about the facility layout, and gave no indication that she was preparing to walk into an environment that could kill her in minutes. As she left to review the technical documentation, Kethrix found himself calculating the odds of this endeavor ending in disaster. The probability was, to put it scientifically, not encouraging. But they were out of options, and the humans had developed a curious reputation in their brief time among the stars. They showed up in places other species avoided. They volunteered for assignments that saner beings declined. They had a peculiar habit of surviving situations that should have killed them, then acting like it was perfectly routine. Perhaps, Kethrix thought, that confidence wasn't entirely misplaced after all, or perhaps they were about to learn a very expensive lesson about the difference between bravery and stupidity. Time would tell, and he suspected it wouldn't take long. When she finally activated the rebreather mask, it felt almost anticlimactic. The pure oxygen mix flooded into her system, and her saturation levels climbed back to 99% within seconds. She took several deep breaths, and even through the mask, Kethrix could see the relief on her face. "Okay," she said, voice slightly muffled. "That's much better. I can see why you all were concerned. You conducted a 23-minute survey in an atmosphere that should have incapacitated you in under 5 minutes, Kethrix said, reviewing the telemetry data with something approaching disbelief. It was only 23 minutes. Felt shorter. She started walking back toward the airlock, movements more energetic now that she had proper oxygen flow. Good news is the damage is repairable. Bad news is it's going to take some creative problem solving. The corrosion is worse than the initial reports suggested, and several components need complete replacement. Can you complete the repairs within the timeline? With the right equipment and maybe another person for the heavy lifting? Absolutely. The real trick is going to be working fast enough to minimize atmospheric exposure while not rushing so much that we make mistakes. The airlock cycled, bringing her back into the controlled environment of the station. When the interior door opened, she removed her rebreather and took a deep breath of properly filtered station air. Her face was flushed, eyes slightly bloodshot, and a thin sheen of sweat covered her forehead. She looked, Kethrix thought, like someone who had just completed a vigorous workout rather than someone who'd spent nearly half an hour in conditions lethal to most known life forms. The medical officer descended on her immediately, scanners humming as they assessed her condition, elevated inflammatory markers in her respiratory system, minor tissue irritation, slightly elevated stress hormones, but nothing that qualified as actual damage. "You're insane," the medical officer declared. "Medically speaking." The human grinned, that teeth-showing expression that still unsettled Kethrix on a primal level. "Medically speaking, I'm within acceptable parameters for my species. We just happen to have very generous definitions of acceptable." She downloaded the survey data, compiled her notes, and submitted a preliminary repair plan within 2 hours. Kethrix reviewed it with growing comprehension of why humans had developed such a peculiar reputation across the Federation. They didn't just survive hostile environments through technology or protective equipment, though they used both when sensible. They survived because their biology was fundamentally designed for a world that refused to make life easy. Adaptation, she'd called it. Looking at the data, at the telemetry showing how her body had compensated for atmospheric conditions that should have been immediately fatal, Kethrix understood. Humans weren't the strongest species, or the fastest, or the most environmentally resistant, but they had the uncomfortable distinction of being able to function in a wider range of hostile conditions than anything else in the Federation had encountered. It was, he reflected, both impressive and deeply concerning. a species that could smoke a cigarette in a Class 7 atmosphere and treat it as a minor inconvenience, possessed a certain reckless durability that explained quite a bit about their rapid expansion across the stars. The question wasn't whether she could complete the repairs. After today's demonstration, Kethrix didn't doubt her capability. The real question was what other supposedly impossible environments humans would decide to conquer next, and whether the rest of the galaxy was prepared for a species that treated lethality ratings as gentle suggestions rather than firm boundaries. The repairs began at dawn, which on Kepler 442f meant the same toxic atmosphere, but with slightly better lighting. The human had requisitioned a second team member, a Karathi engineer whose specialty was reactor systems and whose survival instinct was apparently on sabbatical. "I still believe this is ill-advised," the Karathi muttered through his full environmental suit, which looked like it could survive re-entry into a gas giant. Compared to the human's light gear, he resembled a walking bunker next to a hiker. "Noted and logged," she replied, checking her tool harness. The rebreather hung ready this time, though Kethrix noticed she hadn't bothered putting it on yet. "We've got 6 hours of work ahead. Let's make them count." They descended into the damaged section through an access corridor that had lost atmospheric integrity 3 levels down. The transition from breathable station air to planetary atmosphere was gradual, which somehow made it worse. Each level brought increased carbon dioxide, elevated pressure, and the creeping realization that turning back became less viable with every step forward. The reactor chamber was a cathedral of broken machinery and corroded metal. Coolant had leaked, mixing with atmospheric compounds to create crystalline structures that grew across surfaces like malignant frost. The backup containment system flickered with warning lights, counting down to inevitable failure with mechanical indifference. "This is significantly worse than the survey indicated," the Karathi said, his translator conveying what might have been panic or excitement. Both emotions apparently sounded similar in his language. "Survey was external assessment only," the human said, already moving toward the primary coolant junction. "Now we see what's really broken." What was really broken turned out to be everything critical and several things that shouldn't have been possible to break. The primary coolant pump had seized completely, its housing corroded through in 3 places. Secondary systems had compensated until they couldn't, then failed in a cascade that left the reactor running on what amounted to mechanical hope and prayers to gods of thermodynamics. The human worked with economical precision, cutting away damaged components while her Karathi partner struggled to maintain steady hands in the oppressive atmosphere. His suit's environmental systems strained audibly, compensating for external pressure that wanted very much to compress him into something denser. "How are you functioning?" he asked, watching her wrestle a corroded pipe free with nothing but basic gloves protecting her hands. "Lots of practice ignoring my body's survival instincts," she said. Her breathing had gone rapid and shallow, processing what little oxygen existed while her lungs complained about everything else. Sweat dripped down her face, evaporating in the dry heat faster than it formed. 2 hours into the work, complications evolved from theoretical to immediate. The backup containment system, apparently offended by their presence, decided to fail ahead of schedule. Warning klaxons echoed through the chamber, and Kethrix's voice crackled over the communication system with barely restrained alarm. "Containment breach in Sector 7. You need to evacuate immediately." The human glanced at the Karathi, then at their half-completed repairs, then at the reactor core that was now actively leaking radiation at levels that made the toxic atmosphere seem downright hospitable by comparison. "Negative," she said, tightening a coupling with perhaps more force than necessary. "We're 3 hours from completion. If we leave now, the whole facility becomes a radioactive monument to poor timing." "The radiation levels exceed safe exposure thresholds," Kethrix insisted. "Everything about this planet exceeds safe exposure thresholds," she countered, moving to the next junction. "We're committed now. Might as well finish what we started." The Karathi made a sound that his translator refused to interpret, which was probably for the best. But he didn't leave. Instead, he handed her the next tool she needed and repositioned himself to block some of the radiation streaming from the damaged sector. In the monitoring station, Kethrix watched their vitals with growing dread and reluctant admiration. The human's radiation exposure climbed into ranges that would require medical intervention. Her respiratory distress markers peaked into zones that suggested her lungs were staging a formal protest. Her core temperature elevated to levels that indicated her body's cooling systems were losing their battle against environmental heat and physical exertion, and still, she kept working. Because apparently, when humans committed to finishing a job, minor concerns like atmospheric toxicity and ionizing radiation became background noise rather than stopping conditions. The galaxy, Kethrix reflected, was going to have to significantly revise its understanding of what constituted survivable working conditions. Humans had just rewritten the entire classification system with a wrench and what could only be described as weaponized stubbornness. The final hour tested limits that most species didn't know existed. The reactor core, apparently unimpressed by their repair efforts, decided to remind everyone why Class 7 worlds earned their designation. Coolant pressure spiked erratically, temperature readings climbed into ranges that made the monitoring equipment question its own accuracy, and the containment field developed what engineers euphemistically called structural inconsistencies. In layman's terms, everything was going catastrophically wrong at once. "We need to reroute the tertiary coolant line through the backup manifold," the human said, her voice hoarse from breathing atmosphere that was 90% things lungs weren't designed to process. "It's our only option." "That manifold is in the breach sector," the Karathi pointed out, his suit alarms creating a symphony of distress. "The radiation levels there are lethal." "Lethal is a spectrum," she replied, which was possibly the most human response ever uttered. She grabbed a lead-lined tarp from their equipment pile, draped it over her shoulders like the world's least fashionable cape, and headed directly into the sector that every safety protocol screamed to avoid. Kethrix watched her radiation badge turn colors that shouldn't exist outside of abstract art, cycling through warning levels like she was speedrunning a safety violation checklist. Her hands shook as she connected the coolant line, whether from radiation exposure, carbon dioxide poisoning, atmospheric pressure, or just general existential fatigue was anyone's guess. Probably all of the above, seasoned with adrenaline and what humans called spite. The coupling locked into place with a satisfying click that echoed through the chamber. Coolant flooded through the new pathway, and the reactor's angry red warnings began their slow fade to cautious amber. Temperature readings stabilized, pressure equalized. The containment field stopped threatening to turn the entire facility into an expensive crater. "Reactor stable," she announced, emerging from the radiation zone looking like she'd personally fought entropy to a draw. "Backup systems engaged. We're good for another 6 months minimum." The Karathi sagged against a support pillar, his suit's medical readouts suggesting he'd need a week in medical bay and possibly therapy. The human, by contrast, finally put on her rebreather and took several deep pulls of actual oxygen, her body drinking it in like someone discovering water after crossing a desert. The return trip to the station felt longer than the descent, each step a negotiation between determination and muscles that had filed formal complaints 3 hours ago. When the airlock finally cycled and proper atmosphere flooded the chamber, the human removed her rebreather and smiled, an expression that showed entirely too many teeth for someone who should probably be unconscious. Medical descended on them both with scanners and concerned clicking sounds. The Karathi required immediate intervention for radiation exposure and atmospheric stress. The human required observation, hydration, respiratory therapy, and what the medical officer described as a stern lecture about occupational safety that you will absolutely ignore. "Probably," she agreed cheerfully, accepting the water dispenser with hands that still trembled slightly. "But the reactor's fixed, the facility is operational, and nobody died. I'm calling that a win." Kethrix reviewed the final reports, while the human recovered in medical bay, coughing up things that the medical staff found both fascinating and horrifying. Her radiation exposure would require monitoring for months. The atmospheric damage to her lungs would heal probably, given time and proper treatment. She'd lost 3 kilograms during the 6-hour repair session, burned through calories fighting an environment that wanted her dead. And she'd succeeded where every simulation had predicted failure. The Federation's classification system didn't have a category for species that treated lethal as negotiable. Perhaps that was an oversight that needed correction. Or perhaps humans simply existed outside normal parameters, occupying a space between reckless and capable that defied conventional understanding. 3 days later, the human prepared to depart, cleared by medical staff who seemed genuinely surprised she'd survived, let alone recovered enough to travel. Kethrix met her at the shuttle dock, carrying the official completion documents and a question that had bothered him since that first survey. Why? He asked simply. Why volunteer for something this dangerous? She considered the question, while securing her gear, then shrugged with the casual dismissal of someone who'd looked at mortality and decided it wasn't that impressive. Someone had to do it. Might as well be someone from a species that spent its entire existence figuring out how to survive places we shouldn't. That's insane. That's humanity, she corrected, stepping into the shuttle. We looked at a universe full of places trying to kill us and decided they weren't trying hard enough. The shuttle departed, leaving Kethrix alone with reports that would circulate through Federation channels for years, studied by xenobiologists, trying to understand how one species could be so magnificently unsuited for peaceful coexistence with reasonable atmospheric conditions. Somewhere in the galaxy, another impossible mission was probably waiting, and somewhere, a human was undoubtedly volunteering, already calculating how many safety regulations they'd need to creatively interpret. The universe remained hostile and indifferent, as it had always been, but now it had to contend with a species that took hostility as a personal challenge and responded by lighting cigarettes in atmospheres that should dissolve lungs. It was, Kethrix reflected, going to be an interesting few centuries. 6 months after the Kepler 442f incident, the Federation updated its environmental classification protocols. A new addendum appeared in the official guidelines, buried between atmospheric toxicity ratings and radiation exposure charts. Human-compatible does not necessarily mean survivable for other species. Consult human operators for revised tolerance assessments. The amendment sparked debates across 17,000 star systems. How did one quantify a species whose survival instincts included ignore the problem and push through? What safety margins applied to beings who considered lethal atmospheres an inconvenience rather than a boundary? Mining corporations began specifically recruiting human contractors for hazardous operations. Insurance companies developed entirely new actuarial tables. Medical schools added courses on human physiology that essentially concluded with they shouldn't survive this, but somehow they do. The human from Kepler 442f took another contract within weeks, this time on a world where the surface temperature fluctuated between extremes that should flash freeze or incinerate organic matter. Her application included a single line in the special requirements section, permission to bring coffee thermos. It was approved without question because by then, everyone understood that asking humans to justify their survival methods was an exercise in futility. They'd evolved on a world that hated them, conquered it anyway, and now applied that same unreasonable tenacity to every hostile environment the galaxy offered. Atmospheric warnings became suggestions. Radiation limits became guidelines, and somewhere in Federation headquarters, a Vrelian administrator updated the official first contact protocols with a new warning label. If humans volunteer, let them. Arguing is pointless, and they'll probably succeed just to prove you wrong. The universe remained dangerous, indifferent, and absolutely committed to being inhospitable to biological life. But now it had competition from a species that looked at lethality ratings and asked, is that a challenge?